Hello and welcome to the BA Brew. I'm Debbie.
And I'm Candase.
And I'm Karl.
And I'm Lisa.
And today we're going to be discussing a subject that is quite dear to my heart, which is requirements and the essentials of requirements, because we are very fortunate that Karl and Candase are joining us for this discussion because they've just written a book called Software Requirements Essentials. So I'm going to come to you first, Karl, and ask you the obvious question that business analysts and requirements engineers ask, which is why? Why did you write this book?
Well, that's a very good question. And I can actually prove we've written the book because we have a very cool cover right here. And this came out just a couple of weeks ago. So I wrote this book without ever intending to do so. I had no notion of writing that. But about 10 years ago, Joy Beatty and I wrote a book called Software Requirements Third Edition. I had written the first edition a long time ago, and then a second, and then we did a third. And that was a seriously big book. It was about 650 pages long. That's not something you're going to read in an evening and say, oh, yeah, I can do this tomorrow. But it's very comprehensive, and I think there's a place for that. And it turns out there's a lot of really big books on business analysis and requirements out there. And it also turns out that people are busy. So about last May of 2022, I just felt like writing something. So I posted a little article called The 6 Most Important Requirements Practices on my medium.com account. And the response to that was tremendous. I was totally blown away by how people responded to that. And I started thinking, maybe there's a book in here. And then I started thinking, maybe it's time for a paradigm shift. Instead of having yet another comprehensive edition of a great big huge book, maybe we need a small book. Maybe we need a book that says, let's skim across the top of the most important things you need to know, the most important things that basically every software and systems project should do around requirements, that's very readable and very short, but has a lot of stuff packed into it to give you a little bit of what, a little bit of why, and a little bit of how to get you motivated and started to move on into the bigger books when you need more detail. And that was our intent with writing this book.
Oh, that's really interesting, because I think you're right. Sometimes we can look at books in our particular area of work or discipline, and there's a lot of information, but sometimes you want it distilled, don't you? Mm-hmm. Particularly, as you say, if maybe you're getting started. So Candase, can I come to you? And can I ask you, because you're working with Karl, and Karl's an old friend of the Brew, but can I ask you, how did you go about identifying, well, what are the essential practices?
Sure. So obviously, Karl had an initial list of 6 that came from the article, and he kind of brainstormed, probably even before coming to me, what he thought the 20 were. And 20 was kind of a random number. It could have been 19 or 21, but 20 was nice and round. And so I reviewed that, and most of them made sense. So we made small tweaks as we went through, like especially around defining the solution, which I think is practice number 3. That one went through multiple iterations before we landed on like what the final practice title would be, especially with regards to understanding business problems and understanding your business objectives. So it really started with Karl and then was an iterative process as we wrote the book.
In fact, I can step back from that and give you the part that started with Karl that led to that. Is I took the 3rd edition, which describes about 52 practices. And Debbie, you wrote a book once that describes 99, if I recall correctly, business analysis practices. And the Babok has about 1 billion practices in it. So there's all these big books. So I looked at the 52 or so in the 3rd edition, and I just went down the list and I said, which of these strike me as particularly important and particularly universal as applying to basically every project, no matter what kind of product people are building, no matter what kind of development environment they're using or development approach they're taking. And that's how I ended up with the 20, and then what Candase said.
Yes, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think when you work in projects or even pre-projects, you do look for the essentials sometimes because we don't have time to do everything. So I'm going to come to Lisa now. Sorry, Lisa. But what would you say would be, in your experience, some of the essential things that you do around requirements?
Requirements. Well, actually, I've looked through today, I've looked through the sort of contents of your book, and I'd have to say it's wonderful because you've taken your 20 different practices and you distributed it around the requirements engineering framework. And actually, the bit that I really liked was before that, you've got a lay in the foundation section. And it's got all the things that kind of answers my question, Debbie, because there's things like, sort of setting your objectives, setting your boundaries, identifying stakeholders and bringing them into it. Just those kind of things, really. And I think that's it's exactly where you should start.
Yes, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I quite like the framework as well. I think I always say to people, if you're thinking about requirements, if you've got a framework to hang it off, it doesn't half make it easier to learn and understand and to practice and apply. So I really like the fact that you've applied a framework as well, and you've slotted the 20 practices across that framework. I think that really works well, and it's quite immediate then for somebody who's looking at this. But if I pick out a practice that I particularly love in requirements, okay, it is modeling, because I love models.
We do too, both of us.
Excellent.
Very much so.
I don't know why, but I just think, well, I mean, we all know that if you can draw a diagram, you can encapsulate something on a page that could take you, many, many pages to actually write about it in text. But I do think that requirements modeling piece is such a critical practice. I don't know how you felt about that when you were writing the book.
Oh, absolutely. We put a huge amount of stuff about modeling in there. But as Lisa pointed out, we structured the practices through the requirements engineering framework of subdisciplines. And I'd subdivide requirements engineering broadly into requirements development and requirements management. And within requirements development, we've got elicitation, analysis, specification, and validation. And those aren't linear, they're all interwoven in the way you actually work on a project, but it's a nice grouping of different kinds of things that you do. And there's ways to use modeling throughout that. And so we've got modeling appearing in many of the practices in the various sections. And, I really got turned on to modeling in 1986, about 100 years ago. I took a class called Jordan Structured Analysis and Design, and it totally changed the way I thought about software development. And Candase, I think, probably kind of got immersed in this when she started working with C-Level, the precursor to ArgonDigital, because Joy Beatty and Tony Chen at C-Level had written this book on visual models and software requirements. Mm-hmm. So Candase, you were probably immersed in that from the very beginning.
Yes, that was actually one of my very first things I worked on when I joined C-Level, because I joined in March of 2012 when they were just writing the book. Mm-hmm. So I read that book probably 5 times throughout the editing process.
A lot.
But yeah, it was awesome. And then I was always amazed at how amazing visual models are, even in an Agile framework. Because a lot of people say, oh, well, we don't need to take time for models in Agile. We'll just write the user stories. But getting to the user stories, the models give you that framework that says, this is exactly what I'm going to be doing and where. So I use them in all of my story time sessions.
Yeah. And the thing that I like about modeling too, Debbie, is that it allows you to adjust the level of abstraction at which you're thinking and sharing information. And you can drill down when you need to. You can step back and see the forest instead of the trees. You can show the connections between different kinds of requirements, knowledge through the various models. I just think it's an enormously powerful technique. And as Candase said, if somebody's working on a project, maybe an Agile project, and they think, we don't need no stinking modeling, we don't have time to do that, then basically what they're saying is, we don't have time to think. What we have time to do is iterate on code instead of on concepts and pictures, and that's a lot more expensive.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I do agree, because I think that what a model does is it gives you a basis for so many things. So because a model takes a particular perspective, doesn't it? So if you're drawing a data model, it's a data perspective. If you're drawing a use case diagram, it's a use case perspective. And obviously they intertwine. But when you've got that perspective, it allows you to think, right, I'm going to look at this view of this particular world, and this is going to cause me to ask lots of questions. And in asking lots of questions, I'm then doing quite a lot of analysis. and then I can challenge back and all those types of things. So to me, it really is almost the essential of essentials in my book, because that's how I think about things. What about you, Lisa? Is there anything that you think is a requirements essential that you really focus on?
I really like the glossary, the idea of having a glossary and a specification, just because, you come to the party often late in a project, especially BAs, we're not always involved from the beginning. And if you've not got the kind of, got the opportunity to, if you don't already have that knowledge, you've got to get up to speed really quickly. And, any business has lots of acronyms and terms that you don't necessarily understand. I think a glossary is such a great way to get up to speed on the project. If you hear terms being banded around, you can straight away make a note of them, go and ask somebody who knows, put it all into a document. So anybody else who's coming fresh into the project can also can learn from that as well. So I think that for me, that's a really key thing to do.
Yeah.
And it's a simple thing to do. And what I think a lot of people maybe miss when it comes to these various practices is you can do them incrementally. You don't sit down one day and say, okay, let's write a project glossary. What you do is you grow it. You say, here's a term, here's an abbreviation, here's something that I thought meant this and you thought it meant that. Let's write that down. That way we all have a common understanding. And then you grow that over time. And so I think in terms of growing bodies of knowledge, which makes it far less intimidating. It's kind of like a requirements traceability matrix, which is actually something we don't talk a lot about in the book. It's an important technique, but we didn't think it fit into the top 20. But if you get to the end of a project and say, okay, let's create a requirements traceability matrix, that's almost an impossible task. But if you do it every time you do a piece of work, you say, what does this link to? Then it's a trivial amount of task. It's just a habit that you get into.
Yeah. I like that. I like that distinction, Karl, because I completely agree with you. That distinction between a huge task that looks so onerous and something that's just a habit that you just automatically do, it can really, really help. And I've worked in lots of environments where not understanding traceability has caused a lot of problems. So it's always good to get into these good requirements habits. So Candase, I was going to actually ask you about requirements management, funnily enough, and say, and it comes back to something Karl was saying, in a more agile environment, quite often requirements management is considered to be a bit of an overhead. But you have got it as part of your essentials and practices, which I'm very happy about. So can you maybe talk a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah. It's really interesting because you do it a little differently in Agile frameworks, of course, but you still have to manage the requirements. If you don't manage them actively, then you're managing them inactively, and that just leads to a lot of confusion. So even in Agile framework, they may call it, backlog grooming or backlog management, but you're still managing those requirements as new things come in. Where do they fit in the prioritization scale? Which sprint are they going into? How do I know which things are going in which releases, even if I'm doing sprint-wise releases? All of that still comes into play for a product owner, just like it would for a business analyst. So I really wanted to emphasize that as we were writing those practices.
Absolutely. And I think you're so right, because, if you don't manage, I think you said, Karl, then you're managing inactively. And that's really not very helpful at all, is it? When we're talking about the world of requirements, because ultimately the requirements are the reason why something is being done or is needed. Without that, what is the point in anything we do?
You'd think that seems obvious.
You would sort of think so, but I'm not sure it always is sometimes, with some of the conversations you have, The other thing that I really like about the framework and the framework that you've used, and it's something that, again, tips into something you mentioned earlier, is that separation of elicitation and analysis. Because, too often in the past, they've been sort of merged together, don't you think?
Yeah, and of course, in practice, they are, heavily intertwined. You do a little thinking as you hear something. But one thing that I had not seen in a requirements book before that I can recall is a discrete list of activities that characterize what do we mean when we say requirements analysis. It's always seems sort of like this mysterious thing that just kind of happens if you stare at them long enough and you're analyzing them in your brain. But But in reality, you can do more than that. So one of the things that's completely new in this book that I'd never written about before this explicitly is a set of about 10 things you can do, or I think 12 actually, things that you can do when analyzing individual requirements. What do you look for as you stare at them? You know, what thought processes do you go through to try to see, are these the right requirements, good requirements, enough detail, adequately understood to serve as a foundation for building a solution and so forth. And then there's another list of about 8 specific activities that you would do when analyzing sets of requirements to look at interrelationships and gaps and overlaps and conflicting information and so forth. So I was really pleased that we got the idea to take that approach and discreetly talk about, when we say analyzing requirements, these are the things that you might want to think about as you're doing that consciously. And that kind of helps separate it, as you pointed out, Debbie, from just, okay, what do you want? You know, and that elicitation discussion. And that, incidentally, is the worst question you can ask during an elicitation discussion is, what do you want? So we don't advocate that. But sometimes that's what it boils down to, I'm afraid.
And certainly many of the practices straddle elicitation analysis, right? Like when you're thinking about the data practice and understanding data, your data hierarchy and your data objects, that's a little bit of a elicitation and a little bit of analysis. And so we definitely wouldn't say struggle, but we definitely had discussions of like, well, really, which section should this practice land in?
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought that up, Candase, because we did have those conversations. Same is true of like quality attributes. You know, it's an elicitation thing, but it's an analysis thing, and then a specification thing. You know, these all fit into categories. So we point out in the book, in fact, that there are not real clean, sharp distinctions between these activities, that they kind of weave together. But it's helpful, I think, to keep in mind, what are you focusing on in any given moment as you're doing these things and working with data or quality attributes or use cases or whatever. So we did think about, well, should it go there? That's where it made sense once, but it's really more of this. So we sorted all that out, but they aren't super clean separations, and we say so.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly it, because I mean, business analysis is a bit like that, isn't it, Lisa? Things do sort of have that movement about, you know, it's not simple little boxes with things very neatly slotted in there.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think Agile probably helps that as well, in the sense that it's just like Candase was saying, more iterative as well. I think, am I right in thinking, Karl and Candase, does your book cover both approaches, sort of like waterfall and Agile? I think it does, doesn't it?
Well, it does. And in fact, that gets to a really important reason why Candase was part of this project. Because when I decided that this might be an interesting book to write, I think I knew at the beginning it was very important that it be written in a way and structured in a way so that not only would it appeal to people working on both Agile and traditional projects, but it would be obvious to people in various communities that, yes, this is something that we should think about on our project, no matter what lifecycle approach we're taking. Well, I don't have, you know, Agile experience myself, but I knew that Candase had a lot. And so I was really happy to have Candase come on board and bring that perspective. And so she could correct, you know, some of my misunderstandings. She could add a great deal of content. She had great stories from experiences on Agile projects that she'd worked on. And that's one of the wonderful things about working with a co-author is you get somebody else's personal experience stories to come in and broaden whatever you happen to have done or seen other people do. So Candase has worked on Agile projects for, I think, more than 10 years. Is that right? Something like that. And so that was a real important perspective to bring, and very important to make sure the book would appeal to both communities and that they would see the value of these practices.
No, absolutely.
Yeah, and a lot of times, in many cases, it's just small things. It's like, here's how you tweak it just a little bit, because, you know, Agile is doing things in smaller and shorter increments, but the practice itself is still very valuable. So I wanted to make sure we covered that as well in the book.
Yes, yeah, no, and it is good, I think, that you've been able to do that, because so many projects now hybrid, really, and you know, and I always think of requirements, and one of my favorite subjects is non-functional requirements, where sometimes, yes, Lisa's smiling because she's heard me go on about non-functional requirements before. But
not just you.
Not just me, no. Thankfully,
Just
it's
you.
not just. But sometimes with non-functional requirements, you have to dig quite deep, and there is quite a lot of detailed analysis that has to be done, and sometimes as well, there's quite a broad scope, even to just one area of non-functional requirements. And I think understanding that actually you can work in different contexts, but understanding some of these deeper practices is also really quite valuable. That's something that I find, well, I think is quite important in the requirements sort of area. So I don't know, what you think about, that sort of more hybrid approach that does seem to be very evident these days.
Well, the thing that we did around that with non-functional requirements or quality attributes in particular, and I agree with Lisa and Debbie that I'm a big fan of that important aspect of the conversation as well. One of the things about that is that some of the quality attributes apply to specific bits of functionality, and others are much broader in scope and can affect the entire architecture of the application. And that's not something that you write down on a story card and say, well, when we get to this one, we'll figure out what we're going to do about performance. You can't do that. It just doesn't work. Exactly. And so you have to understand that those things thread through the whole project and have very fundamental design implications. And we actually do address the point you made, Debbie, about some of these things get very deep. You can get a huge amount of complexity from what appears to be a trivial requirement. And I think the example we give is something like, you might have a high-level quality requirement around security. It says the system shall require multi-factor authentication for security. Well, that opens a gigantic can of worms with a whole lot of additional questions, a lot of details, a lot of stuff to implement. And you don't just sort of either patch that on or just toss it out as one requirement. It's the beginning of a bunch of conversations.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny because that is always the one that I always talk about is security requirements, because, in so many different arenas, the complexity of that just comes up over and over again. And you have to think about it. And if we try to take a broad brush approach, we are going to get tripped up, in my experience, over and over again. So yeah, it's funny, you've highlighted the one that I always go on about, Karl. So what do you think, Candase? Are there any particular areas of NFRs that always strike you as needing that bit of extra analysis?
Absolutely. And we talk about it in the book. Performance is a huge one, especially when you're in those Agile projects building iteratively, because if you set your benchmarks and your performance requirements on the early stages when you've only built the simplest little workflow, well, obviously you're going to degrade as you keep adding more and more functionality and more complexity. So you have to hit that right balance of like, well, what do I expect this full workflow when I have full functionality versus when I'm halfway through iterating on it? And then benchmark and test that appropriately.
Yes, yeah. One of the other very significant NFR area that certainly comes to the fore a lot with the work that we do is around accessibility as well, and understanding accessibility requirements. And Lisa and I were at a conference recently where there was quite a lot of discussion around this sort of area, and looking at diversity and things like that. And actually really understanding requirements around that when you're looking at solutions, not at the point where the solution is being rolled out, is actually very important as well. Don't you think, Lisa? Because that's an area we also talk about, isn't it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. They can be overlooked, can't they, sometimes? I think they're so vital, really. I think people tend to focus on the functional aspects first and the behaviours of a system or solution. And actually, it's the whole package, isn't it? It's outside of that, the external constraints as well that you need to think about.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. Well, I mean, I think this is great to have an essentials book on requirements, because I think there has been a bit of a tendency over the last few years that people keep telling me that requirements aren't important anymore, which I know, sorry, Karl. But actually, and I always say, but requirements are everywhere, not just for software, requirements are for life, and they're everywhere, really. And if we don't think about it, then we just end up with things we complain about. It's that simple, really. So it's
for the people who think that, sorry, I broke in there.
Go on, Karl.
For the people who think that, I would challenge them. In fact, I would challenge anyone who reads this book to go down the list of practices. It's not a challenge, it's really an invitation. Go down the list of the 20 practices and ask yourself, is this something that would add value to our project? Is this something that we can safely ignore and not get in trouble? So for example, practice number 1, understand the problem before converging on a solution. Who would not think that's a good idea? You know? Define business objectives, which basically is a way to answer the question, why are we doing this? That seems like a good idea to me. Now, some of these things you might decide, don't apply to you, like you identify events and responses. Maybe you think, well, events aren't an important or useful way for us to think about that on our project. And if you ask yourself that question and come to that conclusion thoughtfully, then you can maybe skip that set of activities. But I think if you look at these 20 practices from that point of view and say, would this add value to our project? Would this help us be more efficient, more effective, better meet customer needs, better achieve what we're trying to as a business? I'm pretty sure almost everyone's going to say, yeah, that would be a good thing to think about.
Yeah.
So that's a fabulous way to do it, isn't it? And using it as a checklist almost, just to make sure you've considered all those great practices. Yeah.
In fact, we've got a lot of checklists in here. There are a lot of sections, and I hadn't really realized this as we were writing this, Candase. Maybe it jumped out at you, but we have a lot of practice descriptions where we have lists of questions to ask or lists of things you might want to do or things that are important. And we turn those into checklists. And so the website for this book is softwarereqs, softwarereqs.com. And we have about a dozen or more useful downloads there, including document templates, these checklists, some spreadsheet tools, and other things people might find useful. So I think it was one of our reviewers actually who said, gee, have you thought about putting these to a checklist? And I hadn't, but I think it was a great idea. So we have a bunch of those kinds of checklists because I find those very helpful.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point because, again, if you are, starting a piece of work, or even if you're starting as a relatively new person in this particular world, checklists are really helpful. And having questions to ask, that's incredibly valuable. So, yeah, I think that's a great idea. So, thank you so much for joining us on this BA Brew. I think we've got some really great hints and tips, and obviously it looks like a book that is going to be invaluable to all of us. So thank you very much for writing it, and as I say, for joining us to discuss it. So that's it from this particular episode. And if any of our listeners and viewers have enjoyed this and want to suggest topics to us, that would be absolutely fabulous. So I'll just say thank you very much and goodbye. And if you wish to contact us, it is babrew@AssistKD.com. Thank you.